Well, hello, friends. I hope you're having a great day today. Well, hey, it's Friday. God has kept us and blessed us another week. He's been good to us. Let's go ahead now and gather our faith around us and let's go out of here and let's finish this week strong as we get ready to go in to the weekend. Welcome to another edition of Take 5. Well, hey, this week, you know what we're talking about. We're dealing with the subject called the process of neglect. And we've learned some pretty powerful lessons about this. We've learned it from Solomon there in chapter 24. Although we've not read or really dove into Proverbs 24. We're going to do that next week. We're going to get into it and break it down. But we just used it for a base kind of to build this thought off of that we've been dealing with. Solomon said he passed by the field of a man that he knew was a sluggard. He knew he was lazy. He knew he was neglectful because he saw that it was overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles. The fence was broken down. And Solomon knew that that did not happen overnight. It was through a process we call neglect. It started with he allowed one weed to grow up and he decided, I'm not going to pull that, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one. And the next thing you know, the whole field is overgrown because this man was neglectful. And through the process of time, that field decayed and eventually the fruit in it ends up being destroyed. Neglect is a process of events that leads to the subsequent ruin of anything in which it is allowed to exist. It will change the nature and the purpose of a thing so greatly that you can't even recognize it, and it sure won't fulfill the purpose that it was intended for. You know, the bad side of town becomes the bad side of town through the process of neglect. The crack house becomes a crack house, not because a contractor said, hey, I believe I'll build a crack house over here. No, it didn't happen that way. It became that through the process of neglect. A rundown house becomes that way through the process of neglect that allowed little things, little problems, little issues to go unchecked until they become big problems and eventually make the house unlivable. The next thing you know, you let one thing go and then the roof's leaking and then the roof's falling in and then the porch is falling down and then the floor's falling in. And all of this happens over a period of time, not overnight, but over a period of time that we call the process of neglect. Neglect of anything will lead from decay to destruction. If you neglect your health, you'll go from decay to destruction. If you neglect your pets, they'll go from decay to destruction. If you neglect relationships, friend, it will go from decay to destruction. The same applies to your spiritual health as well. Nobody that has ever walked with God gets lost by taking one misstep. It's not just one misstep. It's many missteps that you refuse to correct. No one backslides overnight. It's a slow fade as they move through the process of moving away from God. So please understand, it's not one mistake. It's mistake after mistake after mistake that we refuse to deal with because of indifference or laziness or whatever the case may be. It leads to the process of neglect, and that is what leads our life, our spiritual life, to decay and to destruction. You know, I believe we all know, you and I, we know people that at some point in our life, they were spiritual giants. They were soul winners. They were prayer warriors. They were leaders at church. They were load bearers and burden sharers. They were people of the Word and people of the Spirit. But somewhere along the way, they allow things to slip in and they begin to neglect the things of God, and they end up becoming a mere shell of what they used to be or could have been. Paul gave some instructions for this in Romans 12:11 when he said, be not slothful in business, but be fervent in spirit and serve the Lord. We learned as we read that this week that actually means never let the fire in your heart go out. Keep it alive. That means we've got to tend it. Keep it alive and serve the Lord. When He tells us to keep it alive, that means we can't neglect it. We've got to tend it. We've got to nurture it. We've got to protect it from the elements. We've got to fuel it. We cannot be lazy. If we are, the process of neglect will cause that fire to burn out. You know, yesterday we looked at the book of Leviticus, how the Old Testament priests were commanded to keep the fire burning on that brazen altar where the sins of Israel were atoned for. They were commanded to keep it going and never, ever, ever let it go out. You know, the same is true with you and me today. When God started that fire with the Spirit of Christ, when He deposited Him in us, when we got born again, that fire that was started there, we must not let it go out. We must tend it. We must fuel it. We must feed it. We must maintain it. If you neglect your relationship with God, it will decay, and decay will eventually turn into destruction. That's the same reason that Paul told Timothy to make sure that he kept the faith and the gift of God that had been given to him, to make sure that he kept it fanned into flame, make sure he kept the fire stirred. He told that young man, he said, your grandmother had faith, your mother had faith, and I see that it's in you, but you're not going to keep it just because grandma had it and mama had it. If you keep it, it's because you have nurtured it and you did not neglect that fire of God. Don't be lazy. Don't let it go out. Keep it stirred up. That's what Paul was telling him. You know, in Hebrews chapter 2, the writer there was talking to Jews who had accepted salvation by faith in Jesus Christ. After some time had passed and they began to face some persecution, they started going back to Orthodox Judaism and temple practices. They began to neglect the exercise of real salvation because it just seemed easier to bring a sacrifice of a goat or a sheep or lamb to a priest than it was to present themselves a living sacrifice unto God. As bad as I hate to say it, many in the modern church have done the same thing because it seems easier to carry out the practices of organized religion than it is for them to maintain a fervent fellowship and relationship with God and His Word and His Spirit. For this reason, Hebrews chapter 2 verse 3 tells us, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? How will we escape? There's only one way out of this world alive, and that's the salvation that God has offered us. So two things we've got to do. Number one, we must not neglect to accept His offer of salvation. And number two, we must not neglect to keep it stirred once we have accepted it. The responsibility falls squarely on us, my friend. We could not save ourselves. Only God could do that, but it's up to you and me to make sure we don't neglect this great gift that God has put in us. Well, hey, my time's come and gone. I got to get out of here. I look forward to being with you on Monday's edition of Take 5. Until then, God bless you and have a great weekend.